You pull the blanket a little higher, feeling its edge brush your cheek as the sounds of the modern world fade behind you. In this space, soft, quiet, and unhurried, you're free to drift through time. Here, history doesn't shout. It hums. It sighs. It breathes warmth into cold nights and folds long-forgotten lives into the rhythm of your breath. So before we set off, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether you're curled up in a tiny apartment in Tokyo or a farmhouse in Wisconsin, you're part of this gentle circle of listeners. And if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, don't forget to subscribe or share it with a friend who could use a warm voice to fall asleep to. Your presence here across time and space makes all the difference. Now close your eyes and imagine this. No lights, no furnace, no double-pane windows or buzzing refrigerators, just the earth hardening beneath you and a wind rising over the bare fields. The year is 1348. And for a medieval peasant, winter is not just a season, it's a reckoning. The first frost doesn't arrive with ceremony. It slips in quietly like a thief in the night. One evening you're tending to the last cabbages in the patch behind your cottage, and by morning your breath curls visibly in the air. The dirt beneath your boots has stiffened. The breeze that once carried the scent of wood smoke and wet hay now slices through your woolen tunic with an edge as sharp as any blade. Frost clings to the windowless slats of your wattle and daub walls, creeping inward, pressing its fingers against the warmth inside. You know what it means. It means the long dark has come. For medieval peasants, particularly those in Northern Europe, the arrival of winter heralded not a pause but a challenge. Life didn't slow, it got harder. The historian Barbara Tuchman once wrote that the 14th century was a violent, tormented, bewildered suffering and disintegrating age. And winter in its silence pressed down on that suffering like a cold, unseen hand. It wasn't merely a test of endurance. It was a slow, grinding attrition. Every night longer than the last. Every fire slower to catch. Every cough in the night a potential death sentence. There's no precise date on the calendar for when the season shifts. You feel it in the bones of the house, in the tightening of your joints, in the way the chickens start roosting earlier. By the time the village priest mentions the coming of Advent in his Latin sermon, half of which you can't understand, you already know what's coming. You've been chopping wood since August, but you know you haven't chopped enough. The irony, of course, is that peasants were never idle, not even in the heat of summer. You work every day until your back aches and your palms are raw. But winter is cruel. It asks more when you have less. The fields that gave you bread now lie still. The garden is bare, your animals are thinning. And still the wind comes. The structure of a medieval peasant home was no match for it. The typical cottage in 14th century England or France was a single-room hut, with walls made from sticks and mud, and a thatched roof prone to leaking. Floors were packed dirt, occasionally lined with rushes or straw. There was a hearth in the center, yes, but no chimney. Smoke from your cooking fire rose and curled under the thatch, clinging to everything you owned. Your eyes stung. Your lungs rasped. But you were grateful because smoke at least kept the frost out a little longer. Sometimes the smoke didn't rise. Sometimes the air outside was so heavy with cold that it pushed the smoke back down into the room, choking your children as they slept. You'd wave your arms, cough pray, then go out into the wind to gather more wood or dung or peat, whatever would burn, whatever would save a single degree of warmth. By the mid-14th century, Northern Europe had begun experiencing what is now called the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures that made winters especially brutal. The evidence isn't just in the tree rings and ice cores. It's in the records of crop failure, famine, and even art. Look at paintings from the era villagers bundled in cloaks, snow on the ground, frost clinging to the edges of thatched roofs. The cold left fingerprints in every chronicle and prayer book. And yet it wasn't the snow that frightened you. It was the slow descent of temperature over days and weeks. the way the sun stopped warming your skin, the way the food stores looked smaller every time you checked, the way the village quieted not from peace but from a gathering of fear. Because when winter came, it didn't just test the body, it tested your memory. Did you remember where you stored the better kindling? Did you remember to patch the corner of the roof that leaks near the goat stall? Did you remember the story about the widow who froze 2 winters ago in her hut with no one to find her? You remember? Everyone remembers. There were no weather forecasts, no charts, no storm alerts. You listened to the sky, the birds, the ground. Old men in the village swore they could smell frost before it came. Others watched how deep the chickens buried their beaks in their feathers, or how often the sheep huddled facing the same direction. Superstition, maybe, but you couldn't afford to ignore signs. You'd grown up hearing stories how the frost could crack the bark off a tree in one night, how your cousin's first child didn't survive her second winter, how some winters were kind but most were not. Even your body prepares itself differently. Your hands, calloused from the harvest, begin to chap. The skin splits at your knuckles. Your breath hangs in the air longer each morning, and it feels strange to speak. It's as if your voice doesn't want to come out into the cold. Your feet never quite dry. Your nose is always running. And still you tend the animals, you stoke the fire, you patch your child's blanket with scraps of sackcloth. What else can you do? And the worst part, the part that creeps in even deeper than the cold, is the stillness. Everything slows. Daylight narrows to a few stingy hours. The sun seems disinterested in climbing. It hangs low as if tired of trying. And in those long hours between dusk and dawn, with nothing to harvest, nothing to plant, no festivals to attend, and no markets to walk to, your mind begins to wander. You remember people you miss. You think about the future, about the fragility of it all. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you let the cold in, not just to your hut, but into your spirit. Mainstream historians have long studied these cycles of suffering. Climate historians often point to the Great Famine of 1315-1317 as a prime example of how medieval winters could devastate communities. One quote from historian William Chester Jordan stands out. "The cold was not a novelty. The length and intensity were. Crops failed not only because of weather, but because fields froze before they could be sown, or because rains came at the wrong time, and winter stretched far too long. It wasn't one bad night. It was a chain of them locked together like links of iron. And still in the thick of it, some found strange comfort in patterns. You knew when the trees began to crack at night that the cold had deepened. You listened to the sound of the wind in the branches. Was it whistling or wailing? You watched the stars more carefully, hoping for clear skies. A clear night was colder, yes, but somehow more honest. The worst cold came under cloudy skies when you couldn't see what was coming. There are even fringe beliefs that some villages, particularly in mountainous regions, tied silver coins or iron charms above their doorframes to ward off the frost. It keeps the cold lady out, they'd say, a folklore figure, believed to knock on windows and steal your warmth if you didn't leave her bread or a fire burning. Historians still argue whether this belief stemmed from pre-Christian traditions or developed organically as metaphor for hypothermia's grip. But as fanciful as those stories sound, they point to a deeper truth. Peasants fought winter, not just with wood and blankets, but with stories, with rituals, with memory. Because survival wasn't just physical, it was cultural, spiritual, and shared. And so you sit now by the small fire you've managed to coax from damp sticks and last season's moss. Your knees ache. Your belly is not full. The wind groans like a sleeping giant just outside your wall, but your daughter is warm beside you. The dog sleeps curled under the bench, and you are still here, still breathing in a world that forgets you, but you remember. You know that winter is a long song, and you've learned the rhythm of it by heart. The fire crackles faintly beside you, casting flickers of gold and orange on the soot-darkened beams of your cottage ceiling. Your breath is visible even indoors. It mingles with the soft smoke that doesn't rise high enough to escape, swirling instead in the corners of the room, clinging to wool and hair and skin. You've grown used to its sting. In fact, on some days, the smell of wood smoke feels like comfort, a sign that something, anything, is still burning. Because in a medieval winter, the hearth isn't just the heart of the home. It is the home. The hearth for a peasant is not a grand stone fireplace like in a manor house. It is a circle of stones dug into the dirt floor. In the best of cottages, it might be ringed with clay to keep embers contained. There's no chimney, just a hole in the thatch where smoke might escape if the wind is kind. The air inside your home is often thick with haze. Your eyes water. The baby coughs. The rushes underfoot grow damp with soot. But no one complains, because the fire is all that stands between your family and the cold that presses in from every angle. You crouch beside the fire and gently turn a small bundle of twigs, watching them glow red at the tips. It's a meager blaze fed by scraps, pine cones, dried moss, even the broken handles of old tools. You remember your father teaching you to dry moss on the rafters. It lights quicker that way and doesn't smoke as much. You still follow his advice even now that he's gone. The fire-like memory is a fragile thing passed from one hand to the next. Keeping that fire alive is a full-time job. There's no such thing as sleeping through the night. Someone always rises to stoke the coals to add more fuel. Letting the fire go out isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. In the coldest weeks, the embers in your hearth are your only consistent source of heat. You don't relight it every morning from scratch. That's wasteful. That's risky. Instead, you bury the coals in ash before bed to keep them smoldering, then coax them back to life at dawn. You learn the language of fire the way it whispers, when it's weak the way it roars when you fed it too quickly. You know how to cradle a spark, and when to hold your breath and when to blow. And even with all this effort, the warmth never reaches far. You can feel it strongest when you sit cross-legged close to the stone ring. The backs of your legs stay cold. Your shoulders ache. The corners of the cottage are as chilled as the open air, and the rafters drip with condensation. But near the hearth there is life. You braid rushes. You peel root vegetables. You grind grain. Your child pokes at the ash with a stick and giggles when a tiny flare leaps upward. You teach them to be careful, to respect the fire. It is friend and foe. The hearth is also the kitchen. Above the embers you suspend an iron pot from a hook, if you're lucky enough to own one. More often you balance it on a tripod or a pair of flat stones. Meals are slow. You stir barley into broth, throw in bits of dried onion, or a handful of greens picked before the frost. On good days there might be a bone to flavor the pot. On feast days a bit of salt pork. But mostly it's porridge and root stew and pottage, a humble mix of whatever hasn't rotted or frozen. Still, the fire makes it edible, even delicious on a cold night. You ladle out bowls with a carved wooden spoon, pass them hand to hand. The children eat with their fingers. There is silence but for the chewing and the soft sound of fire. This is not a banquet, but it is survival. It is togetherness. The hearth is also where stories are told. After the work is done and the dark has fully settled, you sit close to the warmth and speak quietly. You recount how you met your spouse, how the great frost killed the barley crop the year you were born, how your uncle once saw a glowing spirit walk through a snow-covered field. There is magic here in the shadows cast by flame. It makes the small cottage feel endless. It softens the ache in your back. It blurs the hunger gnawing at your belly. Mainstream historical records confirm the centrality of the hearth in medieval rural life. In his comprehensive study, the medieval home historian Norman Pounds notes that the hearth was the sole source of cooking heat and light for most peasants. It was in every sense the nucleus of family life. Archaeological digs at medieval village sites across England have uncovered charred soil rings in the center of one-room cottages, remnants of the humble fires around which generations gathered. Quirky but documented customs surrounded these fires. In some villages, families would recite short blessings or rhymes each evening while covering the embers with ash, a ritual known as banking the fire. It was part prayer, part protection. In Scotland, such prayers included phrases like, "I saved the fire as Christ saved us all." The act became a kind of sacred moment, a recognition that the boundary between life and freezing death was just a pile of glowing coals away. And of course, not all fires stayed friendly. Sparks leaping from the hearth could set thatched roofs ablaze. Children could fall into embers. There are tales of rats catching fire and running through barns, igniting straw and kindling catastrophe. Yet the danger was a price every peasant was willing to pay. You simply couldn't do without the fire. It was as vital as bread. As you sit now, pulling your knees tighter under your chin, you think about tomorrow. Will the firewood last another week? Should you burn the twisted stool leg in the corner? It's half broken anyway. What about the piece of wagon spoke you saved from market day? Every stick matters. Every scrap is measured. Historians still debate whether peasant families in colder regions stockpiled wood communally or kept their piles strictly guarded. There are records of village disputes over wood-gathering rights quarrels that turned violent when the trees ran out. In some parts of northern Europe, peasants turned to burning peat dug from marshes, or even dried dung from livestock. A grim but practical solution. And yet, no matter how dire the situation, there is dignity in the fire. There is continuity. You remember lighting your first solo fire as a teenager, your hands trembling with cold and pride. Now you teach your own children, gently correcting them when they blow too hard, smiling when the first little flame curls to life. It's one of the few lessons in your world that doesn't require Latin or coin or noble favor. Just patience. Just breath. Tonight you'll bank the fire once more. Whisper the words even if they're just for yourself. You'll pull your child's blanket closer to the edge of the hearth and tuck a stone warmed in the coals under their feet. You'll lie down on straw that smells faintly of smoke, your back aching, but your heart steady. Outside, the wind moves like an old song. Inside, the fire still burns. You wake before dawn not because of a rooster's crow or the stirring of livestock, but because the cold has crept into your bones. Even beneath the layers of blankets, if you're fortunate enough to have more than one, the chill finds you. It begins in the toes and spreads upward, stiffening knees, numbing fingers. The fire has dwindled to ash and smoke. You reach out instinctively, brushing against the familiar textures around you. Coarse wool, brittle straw, and the rough skin of your sleeping child curled nearby. It's time to rise. The fire won't rekindle itself. You move slowly, not out of laziness, but self-preservation. Sudden movements in the cold can cause pain, even injury. You coax the embers awake with gentle puffs of air, carefully arranging slivers of bark and dried moss. When the first flicker of flame dances to life, you feel it like a prayer answered. But even as it grows, you know the warmth will not reach far. You must carry it with you today in your layers, in your breath, and in every trick you've learned just to stay warm. You wrap yourself in garments that are less fashion and more invention. You start with an undertunic, made from coarse linen, once white, but now gray with wear. Over that, a thicker tunic of scratchy wool stitched from 2 or 3 different pieces of scavenged fabric. If you're lucky, you have a hood sewn from the remnants of a neighbor's discarded cloak. Your hose stockings stitched from spun wool are uneven and full of patches sagging where the weave has stretched over time. They itch terribly, but they do their job mostly. Now comes the ingenuity. You've saved straw from the last harvest, not for bedding but for warmth. You stuff it into the gaps between layers under your arms at your waistband, even inside your boots. It crinkles as you walk and your clothes puff outward like sacks, but you hardly care. Straw is a poor man's insulation, and in winter poor men take what they can get. Your boots, if you have them, are made of leather, cured with urine and smoke. They are cracked and uneven, tied with bits of cord or strips of hide. You line them with scraps of cloth or fur if you're fortunate, or more straw if you're not. Wet feet are dangerous. Cold, wet feet even more so. The old man in the village lost 2 toes last winter because his boots split, and he waited too long to repair them. You remember? You wrap a cloth over your nose and mouth before heading outside. It's a thin veil woven from flax, and it doesn't do much against the wind, but it gives you something to breathe through, something warmer than raw air. It also spares your lips from chapping too quickly. You'll still end up with cracked corners on your mouth and raw skin along your cheeks, but that can wait. For now, there's work to be done. Mainstream historical records confirm that medieval peasant clothing was largely utilitarian and self-made. According to historian Margaret Scott in Medieval Dress and Fashion, peasants often wore the same outfit for weeks or months at a time, repairing it as needed with mismatched thread or patches. Fabric was precious and nothing was wasted. When a tunic grew too small, it was remade into a child's garment or cut into strips for padding. Lining clothes with straw hay or even moss was a real, if crude, survival technique, recorded in regional peasant accounts and passed down in rural oral histories. Fringe accounts even mention the practice of wearing damp wool under a dry layer to retain body heat, a dangerous gamble as wet fabric can sap warmth, but one believed to trap more heat near the core if done properly. Historians still argue whether this technique emerged from necessity or misunderstanding, but it speaks volumes about the desperation that shaped peasant innovation. You leave the cottage briefly, stepping outside into a world that looks hushed and clean until you feel it. The cold is not just present, it is omnipotent. It seizes your lungs and turns breath into vapor that floats like ghosts around your head. You keep your eyes low to avoid the wind, scanning the ground for dry twigs or animal droppings to feed the fire. Snow is rare in some years, but frost is always there. It crusts over the edges of puddles. Spiderwebs over wood settles into every crevice. Your fingertips go numb almost instantly. When you return inside, you crouch again near the fire. You rub your hands briskly together, blowing into them. Your breath smells of wood smoke and old onions. Your nails are dirty, your knuckles scraped, but the movement brings a flicker of warmth. You press your hands to your thighs, then to your child's back as they stir. You've learned how to pass heat like an offering. It's one of the few things you can give freely. Inside your home, you keep a bundle of clothing close to the fire. Old shirts, patch cloaks, anything you might layer. If guests arrive, which is rare, you offer them the warmest cloth you own, knowing that hospitality is not just kindness, but survival. You remember how your cousin once lent a hood to a traveling monk and received a wedge of cheese in return. Small kindnesses circle back eventually. In the afternoon, the sun emerges just enough to deceive you. Light spills through the cracks in the wall, but it brings no heat. Still, you take the opportunity to hang damp garments near the fire, balancing sticks across the stones to serve as a makeshift drying rack. You turn each piece, carefully watching as steam rises in thin wisps. The scent of wet wool is heavy in the air. You can tell which pieces were worn by which child based on the height of the smoke trail. It's a strange comfort. There is a moment every day just before sunset when the light seems to pause. It stretches long across the floor, touches every corner of the cottage, and paints your patchwork clothes in gold. For that moment, everything looks softer. Even the straw, even the grime. Your garments, for all their roughness and stink, hold warmth. They carry stories. Each patch is a memory. The brown wool on your shoulder came from your mother's cloak. The blue bit near your hem belonged to your brother, gone now. The cord tying your boot came from the market sack that carried barley back from the harvest. And this is how medieval peasants survived the cold, not in finery or silk-lined robes, but in stubbornness stitched into every fiber. Every thread was pulled from the loom with hope, every layer added with care. You don't dress to be seen, you dress to endure. Scholars still puzzle over how these humble people managed to survive such cold with so little. Some argue it was sheer acclimatization, that after generations of exposure, their bodies adapted in small ways. Others believe it was the culture of communal sharing, the instinct to huddle together and pool resources that made the difference. Likely it was both. In some areas, villages would even wrap heated stones in wool and place them inside cloaks or beds to serve as portable warmth. Children slept with them, clutching the heat like a secret. Others lined the insides of their walls with moss or old animal hides, though such luxuries were rare. A single fur, even poorly tanned, could mean the difference between a livable winter and tragedy. You lean back now, letting the firelight lick the walls behind you. Your garments rustle faintly as you move. Your body smells of smoke, sweat, and wool. It is not a pleasant scent, but it is human. It is survival. It is yours. You glance across the room and see your eldest child mimicking you, stuffing straw into their sleeves, smiling as they test how much they can fit. It makes you laugh just a little. Not because it's funny, but because it's familiar. Because in this world, even a small moment of warmth is worth everything. You don't just sleep through winter, you negotiate with it. Night after night, it becomes a silent barter. One breath of warmth in exchange for a dozen shivers. A patch of straw for a few more hours of rest. Sleep for a medieval peasant in the dead of winter is no gentle lull. It is strategy. It is vigilance in disguise. It is a question with no guarantee of answer. Will you wake up warmer or not at all? You prepare the sleeping space as you do the fire with reverence and routine. There is no bedroom not in your world. There is only one room shared by all where eating, working, resting, and surviving happen under the same sagging roof. At the center, the hearth flickering. Near it, your bed, if you can call it that. A pile of straw on the floor layered with rushes, or maybe a coarse linen mat if you're fortunate. It smells of earth and smoke, and the faint tang of livestock who sleep just a few feet away. That's no accident. The animals are not only precious property, they are warmth. On cold nights, the family pig or goat may be tied near the hearth. Chickens roost in corners. You've long since stopped caring about feathers in your blanket, or the occasional snuffle from a cow beside your head. In fact, their presence is comforting. A live body means more heat in the room, more breath, more life. You sleep fully clothed. Everyone does. Undressing would be absurd. The same patched tunic you wore through the day now becomes your nightgown. You may add a second pair of hose if you own them, or wrap your feet in rags. Your outer cloak worn outside to work the fields becomes your blanket. If you're lucky, your family owns a proper woolen blanket, heavy, scratchy, and possibly crawling with lice, but warm nonetheless. It is laid across the bed like treasure, carefully adjusted each night to cover the most vulnerable, the children. And that's where the real technique begins. Sleeping is not done alone. That is a luxury for lords. For the peasant, sleep is communal. You lie beside your kin, your spouse, your children. Sometimes an aging parent or younger sibling. The children are tucked in the middle where body heat is most stable. Adults flank the sides, absorbing the draft and shielding the little ones. You form a human barrier against the cold. This sleep formation has a name in modern anthropology, co-sleeping, but in the medieval context, it was pure necessity. Studies of medieval domestic life, such as those by historian Judith Bennett, affirm that bed sharing was the norm across peasant households. It wasn't merely about intimacy or space. It was thermodynamics, with each body acting as a living coal, banked and burning softly through the night. You lie curled in on yourself, spine-curved arms tucked in. You press your back to another's chest and feel the breath rise and fall. In the silence, that rhythm becomes its own kind of lullaby. If you stir at night, your first instinct is to check the coals, then gently adjust the blanket over a sibling's shoulder. Sleep is fragile, easily stolen. You don't risk waking fully unless necessary. Sometimes, despite all this, sleep doesn't come easily. The straw pokes your ribs. The wind screeches through the gaps in the walls. Somewhere a dog whines. Your youngest coughs and you freeze listening. Is it just a cough or something worse? You've known families to lose children to chill in the night. No warning, no fever. Just a child who didn't warm back up. You pull them closer. If there's a heated stone warmed in the fire and wrapped in cloth, it is placed at their feet or slipped under the blanket. A medieval hot water bottle. They cling to it like a doll. You remember the first time you saw one crack from being too hot and wet. The hiss of steam. The panic in your father's eyes. That stone was meant to keep his mother warm that night. It didn't. Mainstream records affirm the use of such techniques. In the work The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, historian Ian Mortimer details how heated stones or bricks were common sources of warmth for the poor during winter, often placed in beds or carried inside cloaks. Wealthier homes had bed warmers' copper pans filled with embers, but peasants relied on fire-heated stones or animal companionship. You know how to fluff the straw just right before bed. You rake it with a branch or your fingers trying to redistribute the pieces and shake out any bugs. Fleas are inevitable. So are mites. In spring, you'll replace the straw. In winter, you endure it. You lie still and feel the straw shift beneath you, whispering faintly. The sound is oddly soothing, like dry leaves in the wind. Some nights are harder than others. When the cold sets in deep, you find yourself shivering violently, even beneath layers. You hug your knees to your chest. If you speak, your breath clouds in the dark. You murmur prayers, sometimes aloud, sometimes in your head. God, keep the fire alive. God, keep the baby breathing. God, keep the frost from the door. It's not poetry. It's insurance. There are rumors, of course, of sleepwalking deaths, of men who went outside to relieve themselves and never returned, found frozen by morning eyes, open faces still. You tell yourself it won't happen to you. You hang a sliver of iron over the doorframe just in case. Some say it keeps evil spirits from entering during the night. Others say it's foolishness. But you sleep better with it there. And then there are the dreams. Winter dreams are strange things. They come in colors of ash and gold. Sometimes you dream of warmth, sunlight on your back, the sound of bees, the rush of river water. Other nights the dreams are darker. You're walking through snow barefoot. Your hands are blue. Your mother is calling you, but you can't answer. You wake gasping. You check the fire. You check your children. You whisper thanks. Historians still argue whether medieval sleep was continuous or segmented. Some scholars suggest that people slept in two shifts, first sleep and second sleep with a waking period in between, used for prayer, tending fires, or even quiet conversation. The idea stems from sources like the Book of Hours and various monastic schedules, which describe a midnight pause in sleep routines. For peasants, this theory holds weight. When your sleep is shared light and bound by the needs of your fire and your children, it rarely runs uninterrupted. And yet there are good nights. Nights when the fire holds steady and no one coughs. Nights when the wind seems to hush itself and the moonlight filters through the rafters like something holy. You lie between your children, your spouse breathing evenly behind you, and for a moment it feels safe. Not luxurious, not even comfortable, but safe. You begin to hear the rustlings of morning long before the sun arrives. A chicken shifting, a child stirring, You open your eyes to see smoke trailing lazily up into the roof. Someone, maybe you, maybe your partner, is already moving toward the hearth. The day begins again, and as you sit up brushing straw from your sleeve, you remind yourself you made it through another night. You flex your fingers beneath the rough wool of your sleeves. The skin along your knuckles is cracked, and each bend stings with cold. There's no balm for it, no ointment, no salve. You've tried rubbing lard into the splits before bed, but it only helps if you don't move your hands for hours and you don't have that luxury. So you let the cold dig its fingers into your joints and stretch its way through your limbs like a second skeleton, rigid and cruel. You shift your feet inside your boots. The thin layer of straw you stuffed inside yesterday morning has already broken down into a soggy mat. You can feel the dampness seeping into your woolen hose. A few days ago, your youngest slipped while fetching water and soaked her only pair of shoes. You dried them by the fire for 2 nights, but they never quite lost the chill. Now her feet are always cold. She doesn't say anything, but you see how she walks cautious, limping slightly. You give her the warm stone tonight. You go without. Frostbite isn't something you call by name, but you've seen it. You've seen fingers blacken at the tips and toes shrivel like spoiled fruit. You remember last year a boy from the next village lost 2 of his fingers after he fell asleep outside gathering kindling. They said he was just resting for a moment. They said it was only meant to be a short pause. No one knew how long he sat in the snow. But when they found him, his hands were curled into claws, stiff and frozen. He lived, mostly, but he hasn't been the same since. And yet life must go on. The fire needs tending. The goat needs milking. The privy must be dug again because the old one froze solid. There's no choice in the matter. The cold is part of your world, an uninvited guest, who never leaves pressing in through the walls, curling under the door, breathing down your neck even indoors. Your hands ache as you grip the wooden bucket, the handle worn smooth from years of use. You carry water from the stream, careful not to spill. The ice along the bank is thick and your boots slide on the packed earth. You place one foot carefully in front of the other. The wind stings your eyes. Your lips are cracked and bleeding. When you smile at your child on the way back, the skin splits anew at the corner of your mouth. There are moments when the cold becomes a dull throb like a second heartbeat. You stop noticing the sting of it, and it simply becomes part of you. But then something touches your skin, a metal buckle, a snowflake melting on your wrist, and the sharpness returns quick and mean. You shake your hands to bring the feeling back, watching your fingertips turn red, then pale, then red again. Mainstream historical records confirm the harsh physical toll of winter on the lower classes. In his studies on medieval health historian Piers D., Mitchell notes that exposure injuries such as frostbite and chilblains were common, especially among those who lacked proper footwear and hand coverings. While wealthier individuals might afford fur-lined gloves or boots, peasants relied on rag straw and thick wool, which absorbed moisture and retained cold. These makeshift protections often worsened injuries, rather than preventing them. One remedy passed down in oral tradition involved rubbing frost-bitten limbs with snow, or dipping them in icy water, a practice modern medicine now recognizes as harmful. But in the absence of knowledge, any treatment that promised sensation was welcome. In some villages, healers recommended pressing frozen hands between the thighs or against the belly for warmth, a method that, crude though it was, often worked better than snow or ash. You've done this. When your child's fingers go numb, you pull her hands into your coat and wrap them in your own. You breathe on them, whispering reassurance. There now. Come back to me. You know the danger signs. When the fingers go white, when they stop hurting, that's when the real fear begins. Sometimes you don't notice your own pain until much later. You'll be mending a fence or chopping kindling, and suddenly realize that your grip isn't what it was. You've lost strength without realizing it. Your hands shake. Your knees ache. The cold finds its way into your joints and settles there. It burrows into your hips like a parasite. Even when you sit beside the fire, you feel its echo. Elders suffer most. You've watched your mother age 10 winters in just 3. Her hands have twisted from arthritis, her fingers curled like roots. She walks with a stick now even inside the house. She wears 2 cloaks and still shivers. You lay extra straw beneath her sleeping mat. You place the warmest stone beside her feet. But you can't stop the way her bones groan when she moves the soft hissing intake of breath when she stands. The cold shows no mercy, and yet despite everything you endure, because you have to, because you always have, because somewhere deep inside you there's a spark of stubbornness that no winter wind can extinguish. You feel it when you grip your child's hand, when you brush snow off the roof with a broom of bundled twigs, when you rub a cracked knuckle and whisper, "Almost spring." Fringe sources, even a few medieval medical texts, suggest bizarre winter remedies. Some healers swore by tying warm onions to the feet at night. Others recommended wrapping affected limbs in boiled cabbage leaves, or soaking cloth in vinegar and urine. One 14th century manuscript from France advised rubbing the skin with warm goose fat, then covering it in wool and sleeping by the hearth. Historians still argue whether these treatments had any real effect or simply offered a psychological comfort, a sense that something was being done. You've tried the goose fat. It works. A little. When it's fresh. When you can spare it. You also remember stories passed down through the village about people who fell asleep in the snow and never woke up. You were told never to lie down outside even for a moment, no matter how tired you were. The snow steals your breath, your father once warned. He used to say that the cold doesn't kill with knives, it kills with lullabies. Soft, silent, seductive. And it's true. On the worst nights when the wind screams like a beast and the stars vanish behind clouds, the cold presses so close that even your thoughts slow. You find yourself staring at the fire, blinking slowly, your fingers limp in your lap. That's when your spouse nudges you. Sleep now. Lay down. They cover you with the thickest part of the blanket and tuck it under your chin. You feel the edge of warmth crawling up your chest, settling over your ribs. Your breath comes slower, but you are still here. You survived another day. The cold may bite at your skin, but it's hunger that gnaws at your soul. A different kind of ache, quieter, more enduring. It doesn't jolt you awake like icy feet or numb fingers. It's simply always there, lurking, stretching. A hollow space inside your belly that no amount of thin broth or dry bread ever seems to fill. In the dead of a medieval winter, the peasant's greatest foe was not just the weather. It was the creeping, relentless absence of food. By the time the frost sets in, the last of the autumn stores have been carefully measured and counted. Your root cellar is little more than a pit dug into the earth and lined with straw. But you know exactly what's down there. How many turnips? How many onions? How many shriveled apples wrapped in cloth? You remember harvesting them. You remember the feeling of dirt under your fingernails and the sound of your knife slicing through the stem. Now they sit in shadow, waiting to be eaten slowly, rationed one by one. Breakfast in winter is not a meal. It is an act of restraint. You boil water over the hearth and drop in a few oats. Maybe some dried leeks, maybe a cracked piece of barley bread from 3 days ago. It softens barely. You spoon it into wooden bowls just enough to warm your children's bellies, just enough to quiet their complaints. You take what's left. If anything, you don't think of hunger as a punishment. You think of it as routine. You've grown used to the way your stomach contracts and quiets itself after a while. It doesn't growl anymore. It sighs. You grow lightheaded when you stand too fast. You move slowly, deliberately. You conserve energy because every step, Every chore, every breath burns calories you can't easily replace. Mainstream historical records paint a stark picture of medieval hunger. In famine and food supply in the Greco-Roman world, but also echoed in works by medievalists like Barbara Harvey. The consensus is clear: winter was the hungry season. Crop yields were unreliable, especially during the cooler periods of the 14th and 15th centuries, and food preservation methods were primitive. Salted meats, dried legumes, smoked fish. These were not always available to peasants. When available, they were prized, hoarded, and stretched to their limits. Sometimes desperation set in early. You remember one year when the rains ruined the barley harvest. The grain sprouted in the fields and rotted before it could be stored. The village mill was silent for weeks. You lived on wild greens, boiled tree bark, and roasted acorns that tasted like bitterness itself. Your neighbor tried to ferment potato peels. Another dug up nettle roots and made paste from it. You ate what you could. And when that ran out, you waited. You prayed. Fringe accounts from regional folklore tell of bread, made from ground-up tree bark, mixed with rye flour and dried herbs. It caused stomach cramps and headaches, but it was food, or at least close enough. In the far north, some villages mixed straw and lichen into flour to stretch it. In France, peasants in the 14th century were known to grind dried grape skins, leftovers from winemaking, into a paste used for soup. Historians still argue whether these methods offered any real nutrition, or if they were simply symbolic meals that fed the spirit more than the body. Dinner, if it can be called that, is much like breakfast. Another round of pottage, this time perhaps with a bone boiled so long it's more splinter than meat. The children chew on it anyway, sucking out the marrow. You pick the softest turnip and mash it into the bowl with your fingers. The broth simmers gently in the iron pot, and the steam fogs your eyelashes. You catch a faint scent of onion and lard, and for a moment your mouth waters. Then it's gone. You don't talk much while eating. There isn't much to say. Sometimes you try to tell a story, make the children laugh, so they don't notice the portions getting smaller. Other times silence is easier. You focus on chewing, slowly making the meal last longer. When the pot is empty, you scrape the bottom with a bit of bread crust, then lick your fingers, then wipe the bowl with a cloth, and save it for tomorrow. Every morsel counts. You've learned to stretch ingredients in ways that feel more like alchemy than cooking. You boil peels into broth, reuse bones, until they crumble, collect fat from the fire pan, to smear on stale bread for a hint of flavor. You've dried herbs in the summer yarrow thyme marjoram, and now you sprinkle them into the soup. Not because they make it better, but because they make it different. Different is hope. You dream of feasts, great wheels of cheese, honey-glazed hams, roasted birds stuffed with nuts and apples. You remember the one time you were invited to a manor during a harvest festival. The table groaned with food, and you watched a boy your age toss away an entire drumstick because it was too dry. You would have eaten the bone. And yet in your world, food is more than sustenance. It's politics. It's class. It's control. The lord of your manor takes a portion of every harvest. It's his right, they say, his tithe, his tax. You don't argue. You can't. But you remember counting your onions carefully and seeing 4 disappear into his servant's sack. You remember how your neighbor cried when the steward took her last bushel of rye. The Lord needs it for his dogs, he said. Her children hadn't eaten that day. Still you share when you can. When your neighbor's baby is sick, you bring broth. When the old man down the road slips on ice and can't walk, you leave a bit of barley at his doorstep. Because hunger like cold is easier to bear in company. You trade dried herbs for stale bread. You swap eggs for carrots. You barter, you beg, you adapt. You know the signs of true famine. You've seen the thinness in children's arms, the hollowness in their cheeks. You've heard of places where they eat leather, boil belts, chew old shoes. You're not there. Not yet. But the thought lives at the back of your mind like a wolf pacing just outside the fence. Historians note that during the Great Famine of 1315-1317, Some regions of Europe experienced starvation so severe that reports of cannibalism surfaced. Whether these are exaggerations or grim truths is still debated. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart describe villagers eating grass, and monks writing in the annals of monasteries note entire communities wasting away. Hunger in winter wasn't rare. It was expected. You whisper to your children before bed, "Tomorrow we'll have something sweet." You mean the apple you've been hiding the last one tucked into a straw nest in the back corner of the cellar. You're saving it. You want to see their faces light up. You want to watch them bite into something that wasn't boiled or salted or dried to leather. You want them to remember that food can still bring joy. You lie awake long after they sleep, listening to their breaths. Your stomach is tight, empty, but you don't get up. You don't eat the apple. Not yet. Because in this world, hope is measured in bites, and some things are worth waiting for. You kneel beside the hearth, watching the last few coals breathe their orange glow beneath a coating of pale ash. The warmth they offer is meager, but it is still something still more than nothing. And in the dead of medieval winter, every flicker of heat is a victory. You've learned to treat it like treasure. You've learned through years of watching and trying and failing how to coax warmth from the humblest materials. Because when the wind screams through the thatch and the walls seep frost from their bones, warmth doesn't come from luxury. It comes from ingenuity. There is no central heating here. No roaring fireplace with stacked logs ready to burn through the night. What you have is limited and precious. A few small branches, some twigs gathered from the forest floor, maybe a brick of peat or a clump of dried dung. These are your tools, and you wield them like an alchemist, hoping to conjure something more than just smoke. In the early morning, you wake before the others. You take the stone you warmed the night before and slip it into your child's blanket, pressing it gently near their feet. Then you rise, wrapping your cloak around your shoulders, and begin the day's search for fuel. You head to the edge of the field, to the ditch, where wind-blown branches sometimes gather to the hedgerows that still clutch at dry leaves. If you're lucky, you find a few broken twigs, a scatter of bark, a chunk of root dry enough to burn. If not, you gather whatever you can. A bit of straw, a handful of animal droppings, the crumbling remains of last year's woodpile. Nothing is wasted. Even ashes from the fire are saved, used to scrub pots, make soap, or spread in the garden. When the ground thaws, you know the weight of every piece of fuel in your hands. You know how long it will burn, how hot it will get, and whether it's worth using now or saving for the night. It is a grim sort of arithmetic one, based not on numbers, but on hunger breath and frostbite. To make the fire stretch, you've learned tricks. You wrap bricks in cloth and heat them beside the fire during the day, then carry them to bed like smoldering companions. You hang cloaks and rags near the fire to catch their warmth, before wrapping them around your children. You dig shallow pits in the floor beneath the bedding heat traps, as your father called them, where embers from the hearth can be buried in sand and covered with a stone to warm the sleeping area through the night. It works. Not well, but enough. Mainstream historical records fully support these survival strategies. According to the Archaeology of Rural England, edited by Grenville Still and Annie Grant, many medieval cottages were constructed without chimneys and relied entirely on open hearths for heating. Peasants in colder climates often heated bricks or stones and used them to warm beds. Dried animal dung, peat, and even crop chaff were all recorded as alternative fuels in areas where wood was scarce. In regions like East Anglia or the Scottish Highlands, peat cutting was an annual tradition. Whole families would dig it, dry it, and stack it like firewood. In warmer months, animal dung was collected and formed into discs, left to dry on fences or cottage walls. By winter, these were fuel. Not ideal dung smoked heavily and smelled worse, but smoke meant warmth, and warmth meant life. Some fringe techniques often passed down orally or found in lesser-known village accounts speak of insulating clothing with warmed sand. Cloth sacks filled with sand or stones were heated by the fire, then tied around waists or placed under cloaks during travel. Other peasants rubbed their skin with goose fat before going outside, hoping it would block the wind and trap body heat. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these methods, but they reflect the same truth. Warmth was a puzzle to be solved with whatever tools were at hand. And it wasn't just bodies you tried to warm, it was the space itself. You hung thick cloth over doorways to block drafts. You wedged straw into the gaps between beams. You sealed the floor with mud mixed with animal blood, hoping it would harden and resist the cold. You positioned your bed close to the fire, but not too close, lest a stray ember leap from the hearth and catch the blanket. Every decision was one of balance too far, and you froze too close and you burned. Even your daily chores were calculated for heat. You stirred porridge slowly, standing over the fire longer than needed, just to feel its warmth on your hands. You scrubbed pots not with water, which froze too quickly, but with hot ash. You sat by the hearth to spin wool or patch clothing, always with one eye on the coals. If the fire dipped, so did your spirits. A dull fire meant a dull day, heavy with cold and silence. Sometimes you huddled with others just to borrow their body heat. Not just at night, but in the middle of the day when fingers wouldn't flex and toes curled in on themselves. You'd crouch in the lee of a barn wall, backs to the wind, and share a scrap of cloth or a steaming bowl of pottage. Words were few, but the warmth passed from elbow to shoulder, knee to knee, a language of survival without sound. On the worst days, you turned to movement, chopping wood, turning soil that would not break, running your hands along fence lines to shake off frost. Not for productivity, but for heat. You worked not for food, but for friction. You moved to stay alive. The children, unaware of the stakes, often turned warmth into a game. They buried hot stones in straw and dared each other to find them without burning their fingers. They laid their hands over the hearth's edge, eyes closed, counting how long they could hold before pulling away. Their laughter was thin but honest, and for a moment the cold seemed distant. Historians like Eileen Power in Medieval People described the peasant class as remarkably resilient, not through strength, but through adaptation. It was not the comforts they had, but the discomforts they overcame that defined their lives. That quote lives in your bones. You don't recall reading it, of course. You don't read. But you live the truth of it every day. You know how to trap warmth in layers. You know which cloak belongs to which season. You've learned to line your boots with moss when straw runs out. You've discovered that wrapping one's feet in cabbage leaves, while strange, creates a kind of barrier against the cold. You've tried it all. You'll try more if needed, because the cold never stops coming. It only pauses. You must always be ready. As night approaches, you do your rounds. You bank the fire with ash. You check the stones near the hearth. You wrap your youngest in 2 layers and place a warmed brick at the foot of their bedding. You stuff straw into the cracks by the door and adjust the rag hanging across it. You kiss your spouse's forehead and whisper the same words every night. We'll be all right. You lie down beside them. Your back aches from bending your hands from hauling, but your chest still rises and falls. You are here. The fire flickers low. You close your eyes, and for now that's enough. The night wind isn't just wind. Not in a medieval winter. It arrives like a presence, howling, rattling, slipping through the smallest cracks as if it knows the way inside. Some nights it wails like a dying beast. Other times it hisses along the ground, weaving around frozen tree trunks, curling through chimneys, creeping into straw beds. You've long stopped thinking of it as merely air. It feels alive. Cold made flesh. Hunger made sound. You hear it before you see it. A low moan between the trees, a gentle tapping at the wooden shutters, then a shriek as it rushes under the eaves and down through the rafters. You know your cottage walls will groan tonight. You know the thatch will flutter. You know the latch on the door might rattle loose if you don't weight it down. The wind does not knock. It forces its way in. And when it does, you do what every medieval peasant has always done, you listen. Because that wind carries stories. In the Dark Ages, people spoke of spirits traveling on the wind during the coldest months of the year. Across much of northern Europe, tales of the wild hunt would rise with the frost. Ghostly riders led by a spectral lord or goddess swept across the night sky in winter storms, their howls blending with the screaming wind. If you were outside and heard them, it meant bad luck or worse. So you stayed in. You banked the fire. You said your prayers. You listened. The children sometimes whisper about the cold lady a figure said to wander the countryside on the coldest nights, draped in rags of ice, searching for warmth. Don't let her in, your daughter murmurs, clutching your sleeve as the shutters bang against the frame. You don't believe in her. Not really. But you check the latch one more time anyway. Mainstream historical sources confirm that winter folklore was an essential part of rural life in medieval Europe. In Norse and Germanic traditions, for instance, the wild hunt was believed to pass overhead during snowstorms, sometimes associated with Odin, other times with female spirits like Perchta or Holda. These legends were so pervasive that even early Christian chroniclers referenced them, trying to absorb the imagery into their own calendar of saints and sinners. While the church discouraged such beliefs, they endured especially in isolated villages where literacy was rare and winter was long. You wouldn't say you're superstitious, but you know what cold does to people. You've seen your neighbor's son come back from the forest with snow in his hair and a dazed look in his eyes, claiming he'd followed music through the trees. He walked straight into a frozen stream, nearly drowned. It was the hunt, his mother said, rocking him by the fire. They almost took him. Of course not every wind is haunted. Some are simply cruel, the kind that finds its way through every seam of your tunic. That makes the fire hiss and gutter. That sets the rafters creaking like ship's timbers in a storm. You've stuffed straw into the cracks. You've hung cloth over the door. But still it gets in. Still it touches your neck like a wet finger and makes you shudder. You remember a night 3 winters ago when the wind came so suddenly it tore the thatch from your neighbor's roof. The snow followed right through the rafters onto their bed. They had no choice but to carry the children across the village barefoot, wrapped in sacks to shelter in the church. The priest opened the doors without a word. Everyone understood. In winter, the wind was not your neighbor. It was your enemy. And yet you also know its rhythms, the way it changes before a snowfall, the way it rises at dusk, then dips around midnight. You can tell if it's carrying moisture by the smell wet bark and moss. If it smells dry, brittle, and sharp, then a clear but frigid night is coming. Your mother taught you that. You've passed it to your daughter. You wrap an extra cloth around your shoulders as the wind rises again. You shift the sleeping baby farther from the wall. You move your own bedding closer to the fire. You pull the animal skins tighter. And as the wind begins to sing low and long like a dirge, you speak quietly to yourself. It's only the trees, only the sky, nothing more. But you also check the door, just in case. Sometimes the wind carries voices. You've heard them, not clearly, not words, but murmurs, a girl's laugh maybe, or your father's humming, though he's been dead these 7 years. You tell yourself it's the wind in the chimney, the sound of a frozen branch scratching against the roof. You tell yourself you're just tired, but still, you listen. Some nights you sit with others huddled near the hearth, telling stories to drown out the sound. Stories of saints who lit fires with a single breath, of women who tamed the frost with songs, of the boy who walked through the snow barefoot and returned with flames in his hands. You tell these stories, not because you believe them, but because they help. Historians still debate whether these winter legends were based on real people, pagan echoes, or pure invention. But what they agree on is this: in the absence of heat, people found warmth in narrative. The act of sharing fear made it bearable. The act of naming the wind made it human, tameable, less cruel. You don't always have the words to describe the cold, but the wind does. It speaks for it. In moans, in shrieks, in sudden sharp bangs against the shutters that make you jump even though you were expecting them. The dog growls in its sleep. The chickens shift restlessly in the corner. Your daughter rolls over and pulls the blanket over her head. Still, there is something beautiful in it too. When the wind dies down, there is a stillness so pure it almost hums. When snow begins to fall, the world outside grows silent, like the breath of the land has paused. And for a moment you feel suspended, untouched, a pearl within the storm. You stoke the fire again, careful not to wake the others. You add a single stick, watching the flame bloom like a flower. You feel your hands warm again, the stiffness leaving your knuckles. You listen to the wind outside, which now seems to be wandering off, searching for another village to torment. You whisper a blessing, one you learned as a child. Let the wind blow past. Let the fire stay bright. Let the cold wait outside the door. And just before you sleep, you check the latch one final time. The fire burns low again, but not out. Not while there are still hands to feed it, and voices to pass the time. You shift your weight on the rough wooden bench bones, aching from the cold that settles into everything. Your knees crack softly. Across the room, a neighbor ladles soup into a wooden bowl and passes it to your child without a word. You nod. Gratitude doesn't need language here. In the depths of a medieval winter, survival is no longer an individual act. It's communal. It has to be. When the cold descends, it doesn't respect boundaries. It enters the homes of the poor and the barely less poor alike. It slips under doors, around thatch, between fingers. And so people draw together literally. Bodies huddle. Meals are shared. Blankets stretched across more backs than they were made for. It isn't charity. It's instinct. You remember when the snow came early last year, and the neighbor's firewood was soaked. His children hadn't eaten anything warm in 2 days. You brought over a bundle of kindling, barely enough for an hour's blaze, and your wife ladled out half the pot of stew you'd made with your last onion. Later that night he brought back a round of coarse bread, baked from the last of his flour. No one kept score. That's not how it works. Historians like Caroline Walker Bynum and Chris Wickham often note that peasant life in medieval Europe was more interconnected than individual. The manor system and tight village layouts meant that everyone knew each other's hardships, and often survival depended on that knowledge. When one roof collapsed under snow, 4 neighbors arrived to repair it. When one mother fell ill, 2 others took in her children, not out of pity, but out of practiced necessity. There are days when your hearth is quiet, and you hear someone's voice down the path calling, or crying, or laughing in that strange, high-pitched way people do when they're trying to stay warm by sound alone. You pull on your boots and step outside. You follow the voice and you find them. A neighbor stirring a pot of thin carrot soup, waving you inside without asking if you're hungry. You sit and you eat and you talk. Sometimes the talk is practical. Who's got dry wood? Who's missing a goat? Who heard that a traveling friar passed through the next village and brought news from the wider world? Other times it's nonsense jokes, gossip stories of strange lights in the sky, or a chicken that laid 2 eggs in one morning. The content doesn't matter. The warmth of shared breath does. In harsh winters, communal baking ovens became gathering points. You remember trudging through snow to reach the shared oven at the edge of the village, arms full of misshapen dough wrapped in linen tows, numb inside cracked leather. You'd take turns feeding loaves into the fire, watching them rise slowly, the smell of bread mixing with soot and cold air. While waiting, everyone talked. A dozen people, red-nosed and stiff, all pretending not to notice how close they stood, just to steal an inch of heat from someone else's cloak. Fringe sources tell of informal heat circles, not organized, not formal, just groups of people gathering to pass around hot stones, share tea made from dried herbs, or sing softly around a sputtering fire. Some sang hymns, others just hummed. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was said that a song shared around a fire burned longer than one sung alone. Historians still debate the origin of this belief, but they agree on its purpose. Warmth is more than temperature. It's voice. It's presence. You remember one such night deep in January. The firewood was nearly gone. Your child was sick, her breath shallow. The house felt too quiet. So you took her wrapped in every scrap of fabric you had to the neighbor's cottage. They didn't say anything. They just opened the door wider and moved over on the floor. The stew was already bubbling. The bed of straw was already warm. That night your daughter smiled in her sleep for the first time in weeks. This winter it's your turn to open the door. You watch for signs, smoke not rising from chimneys, children outside with no shoes, a pot not boiling on the fire when it should be. You invite people in. You offer soup thin though it is. You hand over an old cloak, a pair of patched mittens, a half loaf of barley bread. It always comes back. Not the same way, not the same item, but it comes. In an apple tucked into your doorstep. In a mended tool returned quietly. In silence acknowledged. You've grown used to the closeness. Your cottage has always been crowded. Children, animals, tools stacked against the walls. Now add a neighbor or two huddled in the corner, snoring under your blanket, their breath mingling with yours in the smoky air. It's not comfortable, but it is right. You fall asleep knowing someone else is there to stir the fire if you do not wake. That alone brings peace. Mainstream studies of manorial records show that during winters, especially in Northern Europe, lords occasionally ordered the opening of barns or granaries to villagers during particularly harsh seasons, not out of generosity, but to maintain a productive workforce. However, in most cases, it was the peasants themselves who carried one another through the season. Families bundled into single huts, shared tools and food, and formed ad hoc networks of mutual aid that long predated any formal charity. You remember that when the midwife's husband died during the frost of 42, she moved into the potter's cottage. 6 people became 9. They all lived. She never left. She just took over the corner near the hearth and started calling it hers. Some bonds only form in the cold, not because cold creates love, but because it peels away everything else. You learn who will answer the knock at the door. You learn what kindness sounds like in a snowstorm. You learn the exact value of a bowl of soup and a patch of dry floor. Tonight, your neighbor's child falls ill. You hear the cry through the wind. You don't hesitate. You grab the warmest cloak you own, a bit of chicken broth, and a flatbread you were saving. You head out, your feet crunching in the frost, your breath streaming behind you like a banner. The door opens before you knock. Inside, a girl pale and sweating. Her mother exhausted, a fire low and dim. You hand over the broth. You kneel and stoke the coals. No one says thank you. They don't need to, because this is winter, and this is how you survive. You crouch beside your child, her brow damp with fever, and her cheeks flushed too red for comfort. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. Her breathing sounds tight, shallow, like a bellows wheezing through cracked leather. In another season, you might bring her to the village healer trade a loaf of bread or a bundle of herbs for treatment. But in winter, everyone's sick. Everyone's cold. Everyone is doing their best just to endure. So you do what people like you have always done. You treat the illness with what you know. You lean on the old ways. The earthy, smoky, whispered knowledge passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, until it settles into your bones like instinct. You reach for the onion poultice you made earlier. It's mashed with goose fat and wrapped in a bit of linen, warmed beside the hearth. You press it gently to the soles of her feet, hoping the heat will draw the sickness downward. You cover her with the thickest blanket you have, tuck the warm stone near her belly, and whisper the old prayer that's meant to keep fever spirits at bay. Then you wait. It's all you can do. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was a strange blend of observation, superstition, herbal lore, and religious belief. For peasants, access to formal doctors was non-existent. The local monastery might have a herb garden, and a monk who could offer dried mint or sage. But more often it was the midwives and hedge healers, the wise women and herbalists who held the real power to comfort. Mainstream historical sources confirm this. In her detailed study, Medieval Medicine, a reader historian Faith Wallace notes that while elite medicine in universities leaned on the works of Galen and Hippocrates, village life revolved around empirical remedies, combinations of herbs, poultices, teas, and ritual, calendula to reduce swelling, garlic to purify the blood, honey for wounds. If it grew in the hedgerow, someone had a use for it. You know your herbs by feel and scent. The crushed mint leaves help when the baby's stomach cramps. Dried yarrow steeped in hot water eases a cough. You grind elderberries into paste to rub on chests. You keep a pouch of dried nettle tied with string hanging above the hearth, for when the aches get too deep in your joints. You've never read a book, but your hands remember everything. Today, the fever isn't your only concern. Your spouse has been limping since the last woodcutting trip, his ankle swollen purple near the joint. You suspect it's sprained, maybe worse. You wrap it in warm linen soaked in wine vinegar, and then lay it across a warmed plank to rest. He grits his teeth, doesn't complain. Pain is just part of the season now. You've used snow as a compress before, packed it into cloth to reduce swelling or numb pain, but it must be watched carefully. It can burn skin worse than fire if left too long. A neighbor once left a snow-wrapped rag on his leg for an hour. When he peeled it away, the flesh came with it. You remember? Everyone does. There's a jar of honey tucked behind the firewood, saved for wounds or sore throats. You dip your finger into it just a bit and place it on your daughter's tongue. She stirs, swallows. For a moment you see her eyes flutter, and you dare to hope. Honey was called liquid gold by your grandmother, not because it was rare, but because it seemed to carry the sun in its sweetness, a promise that warmth could still be found. Sometimes the remedies aren't enough. Sometimes you just sit beside the sick and keep vigil. You dampen cloths and press them to foreheads. You whisper songs. You shift them gently to keep their skin from breaking. You pray. And always there's garlic. You string it from the beams, crush it into teas, stuff it into cloth pouches, and hang it above the bed. Some say it drives away evil spirits. Others say it purifies the blood. You don't know if it works, but you keep it close. Fringe texts from the 14th century mention more unusual remedies. In the Leech Book of Bald, a well-known Anglo-Saxon medical manuscript, there are treatments involving goat dung and ale, or burnt frog skins for ulcers. A remedy for fever instructs the sufferer to drink boiled nettle with goose fat at dawn for 9 days while facing east. Historians still argue whether these treatments were symbolic placebo or grounded in observed effects. But in your world, you try whatever might help. You've seen some things work, and some fail. When the coughing becomes too harsh, you brew a tea of licorice root, and honey warms slowly over the fire. You remember your mother doing the same for you. She'd sing an old song, half lullaby, half incantation, about the fire god who lives in the hearth, breathing warmth into the sick and the weary. You hum the tune, now soft and steady. Your daughter's breath slows. For wounds, you boil cloth strips and lay them over cuts after washing them in vinegar or brine. For stomach pain, you crush fennel seeds and mix them with warm milk if you have any. For backaches, you wrap the sore spot with nettles stinging at first, then numb. And when none of it works, you kneel by the fire and whisper to the saints, whose names you barely remember. Historians like Monica Green emphasize that medieval medicine, particularly among women, was a form of domestic magic rooted not in potions or spells, but in the sheer act of care. The patient wasn't just treated. They were warmed, held, fed, sung to. In a world where pain was constant comfort, became the cure. You've buried children, neighbors, parents. No remedy lasts forever. But each act of care is resistance against the cold, against disease, against despair. You don't stop tending the fire just because it will die again. You don't stop boiling herbs just because the cough returns. Every effort is a vote for life. Tonight your daughter sleeps more deeply. Her color is better. You check her breathing by leaning in close, placing your ear near her mouth. You feel the whisper of it, a thread, but strong enough. You sip the last of the yarrow tea and stretch your legs. The house is quiet. Even the wind has gone still. You press your palm to her forehead, cooler now. You close your eyes and rest your head beside hers. And for this one night you believe. You pull your cloak tighter and shift closer to the fire, though its heat barely reaches your toes. The wind outside howls like a chorus of wolves, but here in this small circle of light and warmth, another kind of magic takes over. One that's older than garlic poultices and elderberry salves. One that doesn't require herbs or prayers or even much wood. You tell a story. It begins the same way your grandmother always began it. Long before the frost claimed the rivers and the snow crept into the rafters. There lived a girl with a heart so warm no winter could touch her. Your children perk up. One nestles deeper under a blanket. Another stops chewing a crust of bread and leans in. You don't need pages. You don't even need to remember every word. The story tells itself. It always has. Medieval peasants, poor, tired, half-frozen, still clung to one luxury: words. Stories cost nothing and warmed in ways that no blanket could. Fireside storytelling was as essential to winter survival as soup or straw bedding. Not just to pass time, but to remember who you were, where you came from, and that there were other winters before this one, and other springs that followed. The tradition goes back farther than most imagine. In his book, Voices from the Middle Ages, historian Richard Kiekhaefer notes that oral storytelling served a vital social function among medieval commoners. Without access to written records, legal contracts, or scholarly histories, peasants preserved their knowledge values and cultural memory through the spoken word. Around the fire tales were shared of saints and beasts of devils, in disguise of heroic ancestors and clever animals who outwitted the cold itself. Tonight your tale is about a hedgehog who tricked the Snow King by curling up so tightly he melted the frost wherever he rolled. It's silly, of course, but silly is exactly what you need. Laughter rings off the thatch roof. Someone snorts. Someone gasps when you raise your voice for the Snow King's fury. And someone your eldest perhaps smiles in a way you haven't seen in days. You can't make spring come faster, but you can remind them it will come. Not every story is cheerful. Some are warnings. Some are histories. You recall your father's voice, hoarse from cold strong with memory, as he told of the famine winter of 1315 when rains drowned the grain, and hunger stalked even the king's table. 7 years of hardship, he'd whisper, and still they survived. You repeat the tale to your children now, not to frighten them, but to show them the blood in their veins runs thick with endurance. You've heard the tale of St. Bridget and the eternal fire, or of the snow maiden who vanished when kissed. You've heard the one about the knight who buried a coal in his glove to keep his sword hand from freezing, only to scorch his palm and still win the duel. You've heard the story of the bread that saved the village baked from pine bark and lichen, and you tell it all. One corner of the fire belongs to your neighbor's grandfather. He tells a darker tale about the screaming fog that comes in deep January and steals voices. The little ones listen eyes wide, then burrow into their parents' sides. You exchange glances with the old man. You'll tell something lighter next. Mainstream historical accounts affirm this role of storytelling. In her cultural analysis, Daily Life in the Middle Ages, historian Frances Guise describes how oral tradition stitched together the hours of long winter nights, functioning as a spiritual and psychological hearth for the peasant class. In the absence of books or formal education, these stories, half folklore, half legacy, acted as a communal memory bank. You wonder how many of the tales you tell were once real. Maybe the girl with the heart of fire was just someone who kept the hearth alive through the worst winter in living memory. Maybe the hedgehog rolling warmth into the snow was someone's hope personified. Maybe the Snow King is just a name for the hunger and the dark that everyone's too afraid to name outright. One night the story is about a woman who sings to the icicles until they melt. Another night, it's about a wolf who brings fire in exchange for a promise. You don't worry about consistency. That's not the point. The point is the breath in the air, the light in the eyes, the way even the oldest or weariest in the hut lean forward when your voice softens. Children often offer their own twists. No, the wolf had 3 eyes, or the bread came from a dream. You welcome it. A good winter tale is never finished. It grows like frost on the window, shifting, curling, always new and always familiar. Sometimes in the quietest part of the night you sing the ballads instead. Ancient songs that no one remembers the origins of. Lullabies that turn grief into melody. Rhymes about turnips and trolls and trees that whisper secrets under snow. The voices rise in thin harmony, falter at forgotten verses and fade gently into silence. Even now, centuries later, historians still argue whether many of these folk stories were strictly allegorical or served ritual purposes. Did they encode ancient pagan beliefs hidden under Christian skins? Were they meant to teach morals, or just to fill the silence, whatever their origin they survived, because they were needed? In some huts, the story was the only entertainment. In others, it became a barter item. Trade one tale for a turnip, or for an extra scoop of broth. You once received a warm stone for a story about a mouse who outwitted a lord's cat. You felt like a bard. At Christmas, the tales get longer, the spirits more mischievous. Ghosts appear not to haunt, but to remind of ancestors of lessons of warmth lost and found. The feast of St. Stephen was notorious for topsy-turvy tales, lords as beggars' pigs who spoke prophecy, and snowmen that danced. It's all nonsense, of course. But somehow it feels true in the flicker of firelight. And when the story ends, the silence that follows isn't empty. It's full of faces slack with sleep, full of bellies not quite full, but not entirely empty, full of breath and warmth and the smallest, softest flicker of hope. The wind still howls outside. But you've made your own weather now. You've built a world, if only for a moment, where no one is cold and nothing is cruel. You tuck your children in, hum a few final lines of the hedgehog's victory song, and settle down. The fire snaps once, then settles, and so do you. The night outside is deep and unforgiving. Frost patterns bloom across the wooden door like silent white vines, creeping closer to the latch with every hour. Your breath rises in faint clouds even here by the hearth. But something stirs in the air, an energy, an expectancy. Because tonight, despite the bone-deep cold and the threadbare supplies you're preparing for a feast, it might not look like much to a noble. A few parsnips pulled from the root cellar, a half-wheel of hardened cheese softened by firelight, a splash of watered-down ale, and a coarse loaf speckled with last year's grain. But this is abundance by winter's measure, This is Yuletide. The medieval peasant's calendar orbited around the church's great feasts, and none more eagerly anticipated than Christmas. Not for piles of gifts or glittering trees, but for the rare, precious chance to gather to share, to pretend for a brief spell that winter could be held at bay by fellowship alone. It was one of the only moments in the year where even hunger made room for joy. You wipe your hands on your tunic and stir the pot one last time. The pottage bubbles a humble stew of onions, root vegetables, and a few scraps of preserved meat if you're lucky. The scent alone is enough to draw in the neighbors. Someone brings their last apple, another cracks a smile and offers a song. A child shuffles in with a wooden bowl, eyes wide with anticipation. You nod toward the stew. It's enough. Barely. But enough. The historical record confirms this resilience. According to the stripping of the altars by Eamon Duffy, late medieval peasants often observed the 12 days of Christmas, with communal meals, processions, and pageants, even if food was scarce. The church encouraged feasting in defiance of hardship, framing it as both spiritual and social nourishment. Though many peasants lived in deprivation, they refused to let holy days pass without a trace of celebration. And celebrate you do. Someone pulls out a reed flute. Another taps a stick rhythmically against the floor. The fire crackles louder, joining the chorus. You smile. This is more than noise. It's a defiant kind of music, the sort that mocks the cold that sings back to the night. Children are the most excited. For them, this might be the only time all winter when food is shared. Freely stories flow without tension, and grown-ups let their worries slip for a moment. They wear crowns made from braided straw or scraps of colored cloth. They pretend to be kings and angels, and creatures from tales long remembered. One wraps herself in a patchy shawl and declares herself Lady of the Snow. You curtsy. Traditions vary from village to village, but some appear everywhere. The Boar's Head song, once sung in manor halls, has a parody version among the peasants. Instead of a boar, you sing about a turnip, with a candle stuck in it. The root of peace we offer thee, the children laugh. You remember your father singing the same line decades ago through cracked lips, in a winter no less bitter than this one. Scholars still debate the origins of some of these customs. Was the burning of the Yule log a tradition found in both peasant cottages and noble halls, a holdover from pagan solstice rites, or simply a practical way to warm a large room for a long night? Either way, you drag your biggest log into the hearth, light it with care, and whisper a wish over its embers. Your wish not riches, not even spring, just enough. Enough to see the next moon, enough to get the planting started, enough laughter to remember you're alive. The feasts of St. Stephen, December 26th and the Epiphany January 6th mark, bookends of joy in your long, cold siege. On St. Stephen's Day, some villages choose a lord of misrule, a peasant elected to mock the gentry for a day presiding over a pretend court of chaos. You've seen men wear buckets for crowns and goats as royal attendants. Once your cousin rode a pig through the square, declaring himself Emperor of Mud. You laughed until you cried. That inversion where the low became high and laughter was law was no mere foolishness. Historians like Natalie Zeman Davis, in Society and Culture, in early modern France, argue that such customs allowed people to vent social tensions and reaffirm communal bonds. Even peasants needed the illusion of power now and then to dance on the bones of hierarchy, if only for a night. Tonight, though, you don't feel like misrule. You feel like gratitude. Your daughter hands you a spoon carved by her brother, shaped like a bird in flight. You first, she says. You nod, taste the stew, and feel the warmth flood outward from your belly like sunlight trapped in your chest. The church bells, distant but clear, ring across the frozen fields. Midnight Mass begins. Some of your neighbors trudge through the snow, cloaked and chanting. You remain behind with the children, but you hum the same hymn. The sound connects you all. Tonight, even your old dog gets a bone. The chickens get a handful of grain. You light every candle you can spare. The hut glows. And then comes the moment you didn't realize you were waiting for. Someone begins to sing. It starts soft. A carol in Latin, perhaps, or one of those old Breton lullabies, with only half the words remembered. But others join in. The voices layer like blankets, each note warmer than the last. You don't know all the lyrics, but you sing anyway, just like everyone else. No one sings alone tonight. Outside, the wind still prowls. But inside, it's full of song, full of steam, full of something ancient and unkillable. You lift your cup wooden-chipped and drink to the flickering flame that lives in every one of you. You remember the bleak winters when there was no feast, when snow came early and the stores ran dry before Yuletide. You remember years when morning outnumbered singing, but still someone sang, because to feast in the cold is an act of defiance. To lift a cup is to say, we're still here. To laugh is to survive. And as you lay down that night, belly not full perhaps, but content, you whisper one last blessing into the dark. May we always have stories. May we always have soup. And may we never forget how to sing in the snow. You wake to a sound you haven't heard in weeks. It's not a rooster nor the stirring of animals in the byre. It's softer, subtler. A drip. Then another. Outside, just before the sun breaks the horizon, the icicles clinging to the eaves surrender their grip. Water hits the packed snow below with a gentle rhythm. You sit up slowly. Could it be, is the thaw beginning? In the medieval countryside, this moment carried a weight far beyond weather. The first signs of thaw, the sag in the snowbanks, the damp scent of earth sneaking into the air signaled a turning. For the peasants who survived winter on grit and gruel, the melt meant not just warmth, but life. Your bones feel it before your mind does. Something is loosening. Something is shifting. You pull on your patch boots and step outside. The air still bites, but there's a different energy to it. The birds know. A lone blackbird sings from the hedgerow. Your neighbor's hound lets out a lazy yawn. Even the wind feels slower, like it's forgetting its purpose. You glance upward. The sky is pale, less steel, more pearl. Throughout medieval Europe, the peasant calendar revolved around these subtle seasonal cues. Without clocks or forecasts, your ancestors read the world like a scripture etched in mud frost and birdsong. Thawing soil meant work, but also hope. In the agricultural revolution in medieval Europe, historian Georges Duby notes how peasants watched for the early greening of grass or the sprouting of nettles, which told them when to prepare for planting. These weren't guesses, they were survival strategies passed down through generations. Back in your cottage, you kneel beside the root basket. The potatoes are soft, some sprouting pale eyes. The onions are wrinkled. The last of the turnips, tough and bitter, sit like small stones. It's clear the stores won't hold much longer. And yet this is oddly comforting. The food lasted almost to thaw. That's a victory. Your children chatter as they stomp the melting snow off their boots. You send them to gather kindling, but they come back with something else, small green shoots, poking through the slush. You laugh. They're weeds. But right now they look like miracles. There's a saying from the 14th century sometimes scribbled into the margins of psalters. A thaw is God's soft breath. You believe it. It feels divine. The sudden change from bone-splitting cold to dripping eaves is too tender, too merciful to be mere chance. Still, it's not all sweetness. The thaw brings its own dangers. The paths turn to mud. Ice falls from trees in great crashing sheets. Roofs leak. The rivers rise quick and vicious, drowning the unwary. One year, you remember a neighbor's cart sank into the thaw-softened road and was never recovered. Scholars still argue whether these sudden thaws were as consistent as folk memory claims. Some winters, like the infamous Great Winter of 1315-1317, never truly released their grip, leading to massive crop failures and famine. But most years, the thaw was a kind of sacred promise. If the people could just hang on long enough, the earth would respond. You glance at your spade leaning against the wall. It's waiting too. The ground is still too hard for digging, but not for watching. You and your neighbors begin the annual ritual of sky gazing. You look for signs, more birds returning snowdrops nudging upward the sun, lingering just a little longer each day. It becomes your second religion. In the evenings, talk shifts from warmth to preparation. Who has seed left? Who's willing to trade for tools or oxen time? You overhear an elder muttering about the good old signs, frogs croaking early, or crows nesting low, meaning a late frost. You're not sure you believe it, but you nod anyway. Superstition and experience are cousins after all. The church marks the season with ember days and Lent times for fasting and reflection. But in the village, every drip from the thatch is a kind of liturgy. Each morning that doesn't bring snow feels like a psalm. One evening, your cousin spots a hedgehog emerging from under the woodpile. It sniffs, shuffles, and scuttles away into the night. He wouldn't come out if spring weren't near. She says with authority. You believe her. Even the animals stir differently now. The goats are restless. The hens begin to lay with more frequency. You check the bees, still sluggish but alive. And at night, the stars seem less cruel. Their shine feels like company, not judgment. You take the children to the edge of the woods. Together you look for snowdrops. There they are, fragile white bells nodding in the breeze. One child wants to pick them, but you stop her. Let them grow. Let them tell their story. Still, hardship hasn't vanished. Food is still short. The cold creeps back at dusk. But the mood has changed. It's not despair, it's anticipation, like holding your breath before a song begins. Historically, this in-between time was vital. As medievalist historian Barbara Hannawalt points out in her studies of English peasant life, the success of the coming season often depended on how well families managed this transition, rationing food, preserving energy, and planning planting schedules. A single misstep could spell ruin. So you plan. You measure the grain with a careful eye. You inspect the plowshare. You barter with the blacksmith for nails and a new handle for the hoe. Every act feels like a bet placed on spring's arrival. You also pray, not because you're certain it will help, but because it helps to be certain of something. You kneel in the cold chapel, the stone floor pressing up into your knees, and whisper the same words your grandmother once whispered, "Let the earth open and bring forth." In a nearby field, a neighbor begins to sing while scattering ashes onto the ground. For the thaw, she says, to wake it up. Her hands are cracked. Her voice is low. But you join her, because why not even dirt listens sometimes. The children grow louder now, chasing each other through the muddy yard. One slips and lands face first in a puddle. You expect tears, but she laughs. You laugh too. It's been a long time since that sound didn't feel out of place. By the fire that night, you share a single egg between 3 mouths. It's the first fresh egg in weeks. No one complains. They savor. You stare into the flames and imagine planting again your fingers, pressing seeds into warming soil. You imagine green. Not gold, not riches, just green. And when you lie down to sleep, wrapped in wool that still smells faintly of sheep, you whisper to the roof beams above hold, "Just a little longer. The ground is waking." Your breath curls in the morning air, rising in little puffs like prayer. The fire in the hearth has gone out, and your fingers ache as you try to tie the frayed laces on your boots. But you're smiling. Not because the cold is gone, it isn't, but because today is Plow Monday. And that means the world is about to change. It's the first Monday after Epiphany, and while your belly is still half empty, and your bones still remember the winter's worst nights, there's an almost sacred excitement humming beneath it all. This is the day when across medieval villages in England and parts of Europe, the peasantry would haul out the plow, not just to till the earth, but to signal rebirth, ritual, and renewal. You step outside. The soil isn't soft, not yet, but it's willing, and that's enough. The men of the village, young and old, are already gathered. The plow is decorated with ribbons and bits of greenery bright against the gray. Some carry mugs of thin ale, others carry shovels, hoes, or the ancient weight of routine. One boy, too small to reach the handles, follows his father with wide-eyed reverence. Historically, Plow Monday wasn't just about agriculture. It was a performance, a community rite, a moment to chase off winter's shadows with sweat and laughter. According to early English customs recorded in the Book of Days by Robert Chambers, plowmen would often parade through the village collecting alms and goodwill to fund the coming planting. They'd sing, they'd shout rhymes. Sometimes they'd even dress as fools or devils, drawing laughter from doorways still sealed tight against the wind. You remember last year's chant and join in. God speed the plow and bless the corn. We hope for sun and not for storm. Some of the women, though less visible, are no less vital. They've mended the harnesses, boiled the oats, kept the little ones from falling into the fire. They watch now from the doors, tired, proud. You and your neighbors drive the first furrows into the thaw-softened field. The soil peels open like a wound, dark and rich beneath the frost-bitten crust. You smell it, earth, and hope, and centuries of sweat. Your hands blister quickly as they do every year. But that's part of the ritual, too. As you rest leaning on the plow's handle, a crow calls overhead. It's a sound of spring, not cheerful, but familiar. You glance at your fellow laborers. Their faces are flushed from the cold and the work, but something in their eyes is brighter. You've survived another winter. Mainstream historians agree that Plow Monday, while not universally observed, was a symbolic pivot in the agricultural calendar. In medieval England, rural society and economic change historian John Hatcher notes that this day marked the emotional and practical beginning of the planting season for many rural communities. It was a moment not just of work, but of intention. Back in the village, the priest blesses a plowshare with holy water. He prays not just for the crops, but for steady hands, good weather, and a forgiving Lord. These prayers are half religious, half political. Because let's be honest, if the harvest fails, your debts will not. But for now, the Lord of Misrule has been packed away. The feast of fools is done. The laughter of Yuletide echoes faintly behind you. The time for dancing is over. Now it's time for digging. There's a superstition among your elders. Never turn the same soil 3 years in a row. It curses the land. Whether true or not, the rule gives your work a rhythm, a map for rotating fields and resting pastures. You've marked the new plot with stones. The children played near them during the last snow. You wonder how many feet have passed over this same patch of ground. 1,000 more. You imagine some ancient peasant, your ancestor, perhaps kneeling here, feeling the same early thaw, whispering the same hopes into the wind. You find a beetle crawling in the furrow, alive. That alone feels like a miracle. The other peasants talk as they work about births, about marriages, about that odd thing the Reeve said during Mass. There's gossip, sure, but also planning. Who has spare seed barley? Who's willing to trade a piglet for an hour of ox time? These conversations are not idle. They are the real economy. And then someone sings again. The song is half chant, half joke, half prayer. Yes, that's 3 halves. But somehow it fits. The frost is dead, the dirt is king. Let every man his furrow bring. You smile. Your shoulders ache. The plow sticks in a root and you nearly tumble. But you're smiling. Later, back in your hut, your hands are raw. But the children greet you with a crust of bread, buttered from the last scraping of the barrel. It's the best meal you've had in days. That night, as you lie in bed, your partner murmurs about planting onions near the path, so the smell will rise when you walk by. You murmur back something about beans. Outside, the wind has softened. There are no icicles on the eaves. A drip echoes somewhere rhythmic and sure. Historians still argue whether the communal rituals of days like Plough Monday were driven by faith, necessity, or fear. Probably all three. In The Stripping of the Altars, Eamon Duffy describes how even the simplest rural ceremonies in late medieval England carried echoes of sacred theatre, part devotion, part defiance of a world that was never guaranteed. You turn on your side and listen to the soft sounds of your home, the breath of sleeping children, the crackle of a dying ember, the distant hoot of an owl. You are tired, but it is the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after doing something ancient, something necessary, something that means tomorrow might be better. Tomorrow you'll wake up, eat whatever is left, and walk back to the field. And the day after that too, because winter never really ends all at once. It melts slowly a drip at a time, and with each drip you reclaim the world. You awaken before the sun, though awaken may be too generous. Sleep was thin last night, more a series of shallow dozes than anything restful. Your shoulders ache from the day before, and your breath fogs the air as you sit up. The fire has long since turned to ash, and the cold hugs you like a second skin. But somehow you don't resent it. Not today, because this morning the sky is a soft gray instead of black. The edge of dawn glimmers on the horizon like a secret slowly being revealed. And as you sit on your straw-stuffed mattress wrapped in wool that smells faintly of smoke and lard, you realize something strange. It's quiet, but not the kind of silence that feels like waiting for disaster. It's the kind of quiet that feels like a breath held before a song begins. You swing your legs off the bed and stand on the packed dirt floor, wincing slightly as your bare feet meet the chill. You can hear water dripping from the eaves, slow, steady. That sound in winter is a hymn of hope. It means the thaw has come. Not entirely, not yet, but enough. Enough to make the trees weep, to stir the first worms, to tell the world that the dark season has blinked first. Your partner stirs under the covers, murmuring something about lentils and rushlights. The children are still bundled together like puppies, soft breath rising in tandem. You stoke the fire and light a stub of tallow candle. The glow is humble but steady. That's enough too. And as you sit there blinking at the flicker, you find yourself thinking not about today, or even tomorrow, but about what it has meant to survive this winter. This brutal, beautiful, aching stretch of nights, where every ember mattered, every crust was precious, and every gesture of kindness made the cold a little less cruel. There is something in you now that wasn't there in autumn. It's hard to name. It isn't pride, not the loud kind anyway. And it's not quite joy. It's closer to grit, to a bone-deep knowing that you've done something difficult. You've endured. Not just physically, though, that's part of it. You've endured the soul chill of hunger, the ache of isolation, the howling winds and howling hearts that sometimes rose together in the night. You've endured the deaths, some close, some distant, some whispered about from hearth to hearth, like terrible lullabies. You've endured the doubt, and through it all you've found ways to persist. You remember the day your neighbor brought you half a turnip and said nothing, just nodded and walked away. You remember how the children made a game of catching the warmest spot in the house, usually where the goat had been lying. You remember the makeshift curtain that gave your home one room and a sliver of privacy. You remember singing a lullaby even when you wanted to weep. Mainstream historical sources paint a picture of medieval peasant life that's as harsh as it is honest. Historians like Judith Bennett and Barbara Hannawalt, who have deeply studied the lived experiences of medieval women and working-class communities, describe a world where survival wasn't merely about food and fire, but about endurance of spirit. In Women in the Medieval English Countryside, Hannawalt recounts village ordinances that forbade stealing firewood, but often turned a blind eye when poor families did it anyway. Why? Because survival wasn't just a personal struggle. It was a communal necessity. One household's warmth could mean one less burial come spring. That's what you've been learning all winter, the power of interdependence. Not charity, not pity. Just survival's oldest law: stick together or vanish. Today you carry that lesson as you step outside. The snow is mottled with mud now, and the path is soft underfoot. The sky is a brightening pewter, and somewhere in the woods a bird chirps once tentatively. It sounds surprised to hear itself. Your neighbor's child runs by barefoot, chasing a crow with a stick. You flinch instinctively, but then you see the child laughing. And you realize something else: it's the first laugh you've heard in days that didn't sound like defiance. As you walk toward the fields, your hands cracked your boots patched with twine. You begin to notice the small ways the earth is changing. A sprig of something green poking through the slush. The faint smell of rot, but the kind that means life is reshuffling its cards. And that light. You hadn't noticed it before. It's warmer. Not just brighter, but warmer. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants found philosophical meaning in the seasons, or simply endured them like weathered walls, battered but standing. But perhaps it's both. In the Voices of the Poor in the Middle Ages, historian Mark Bailey suggests that peasant culture contained its own cosmology, not grand theologies of kings and popes, but a theology of soil and survival, of sunrises and seed. You think of that now as you kneel in the furrow and touch the dirt. It's damp. It smells like iron and life. You press your fingers into it and murmur a prayer, not to saints or angels necessarily, but to the land itself, to the world that didn't kill you this time. Around you the others are arriving too. The old woman with the limp and the ever-lopsided bonnet. The man with the missing tooth who tells the same story every time it snows. The young couple who shared their salted meat with you in exchange for mending their fence. You are all here. Tired, ragged, thinner than before, but alive. You smile and it feels like forgiveness. This is the final lesson of the cold earth, that survival is not simply about outlasting the storm, but about becoming part of the story that continues after it. You're not just a figure in a manuscript or a character in a prayer. You're a thread in a fabric that stretches backward and forward through time. And because you endured, the thread holds. You hear someone call your name, a neighbor beckoning for help with the ox harness. You wave, you stand, and you go. There will be planting soon, and watering, and worrying about locusts or hail or taxation or God knows what. The year will bring its own tragedies, its own triumphs. You're not foolish enough to think otherwise. But for this moment you allow yourself to feel something rare and powerful: peace. Peace in your muscles, tired as they are. Peace in your breath, still visible in the morning chill. Peace in the knowledge that you face something ancient, and it did not break you. You look back at your home, smoke curling from the chimney, the scent of boiled oats drifting faintly in the breeze. It is not much. It never has been. But it is yours. And it is enough. In the words of medieval chronicler Jean Froissart, the adventures of the poor are not written, for they are too many and too sad. Perhaps. But here in the soft earth, in the thawing fields, in the chapped hands and soot-streaked faces, there is another kind of epic being lived. Quiet, stubborn, true. So you return to the plow. You grip the handle, and you lean forward, because spring is coming, and the story must go on. And now, dear listener, as your body settles and your breathing slows, let us step back from the cold fields and creaking floors of the medieval world. The fire that once crackled beside you fades into soft embers, the frost-bitten huts growing faint like a dream already drifting into memory. You've walked through long winter nights side by side with the villagers who endured each storm with courage, wit, and something like grace. You've felt the straw beneath their feet, the sting of wind across their faces, the deep hum of resilience in their bones. You've tasted their turnip broth, heard their laughter, and huddled beside their hearth. And through it all you've seen a truth that stretches across the centuries, that survival is not a solitary act, but a shared ritual, Let that lesson linger as you let go. Let your shoulders release their tension. Let your hands relax, no longer grasping firewood or mending thread. Let your thoughts slow to the rhythm of a quiet field at dawn. The peasants of the past are still with you, not in ghost stories or dusty tomes, but in the quiet miracle of human endurance. Their story is not just history. It is a reminder that you too carry an ember inside something warm and steady and unbroken. So rest now. You've walked far tonight. May your dreams be warm. May your burdens be light. And may the first green of spring find you ready and at peace.